Okay, Chapter 6, Community Supervision for Offenders with Special Needs. So what do I mean by special needs? Well, in order for me to explain special needs, I probably have to explain special caseloads. But first of all, I'll come back to that. Let me talk a little bit about intensive supervision first. And we tend to group special needs offenders into the intensive supervision load. But really, intensive supervision should be separate from specialized caseloads. First of all, let's talk about intensive supervision. And really what that is just really strict probation. You know, you're going to do closer surveillance of your offenders. They're going to have more conditions and they're going to have more treatment exposure. When I mean surveillance, I'm not talking about some special black ops program where you go out in all your camo gear and you sit and put them under a watch all night. That's not what I'm talking about in community supervision. Although there are some special offender caseloads or officers that go out at night to look for offenders, but we don't do it that way. When I talk about surveillance, I'm talking about going out and doing home visits. I'm talking about doing collateral contacts with the offender's family, friends, significant others, employers, school teachers, whatever, counselors, whoever they have contact with that can give you some important information to help facilitate change in the offender. So closer supervision, more conditions. They might have a special condition for drug treatment or something like that, and then that feeds right into more treatment exposure. The thing about intensive supervision is that this particular type of officer has a lower caseload because they're required to spend more time with each individual offender. So let's say, for example, your average officer, supervision officer, has like 75 offenders. Intensive supervision officer or specialized caseload officer is only going to have like 35, 40 max because they have to spend so much time on that individual. All right, so there's several different groups of specialized caseloads that we'll talk about. The first one is drug-addicted offenders. The majority of your caseloads probably going to have some drug issue. I mean, I've told you this in previous chapters, and I know I'm starting to sound like a broken record about it, but that's just, fact of life in our field. Luckily, we have a drug czar right now who's a recovering addict himself and knows about treatment modalities and the real issues for drug abuse. But I'm not going to get on my soapbox and talk about how we need to quit punishing addicts and we need to do treatment interventions. I'm going to save that for another time and another chapter. So right now, let's talk about drug-addicted offenders. And the majority of our offenders in community corrections do have problems with drugs and alcohol. And a lot of them, their crimes were indirectly or directly related to that. One key thing with drug-addicted offenders is we want to look at relapse prevention. Relapse prevention, preventing a relapse. What are the triggers for that offender? That's something that's usually worked out in treatment, but as the officer, as their supervising officer, you too know that, or obviously know that if your offender's hanging out at a bar, they might be more likely to drink. So you might want to try a special condition where they're not supposed to go to bars. You know what I'm saying? So things like that. A lot of places are using drug courts, and those are specialized courts to deal with low-level drug offenders with a high potential for rehabilitation. Who are those people? Well, first-time offenders, younger, employed, and so on. Drug courts are popping up all over. In fact, in West Virginia, I think we probably have about 18 right now. And we're getting one here in Mineral County shortly. As of January 1, it has to be up and running, at least on paper. So what are they? Well, they're non-adversarial, meaning the judge, the defense attorney, the prosecuting attorney, the community corrections officer, it may be a day reporting officer, it may be a probation officer, but they all work together in conjunction to develop a case plan for the offender to graduate from drug court. And they focus on the needs and the issues that the offender has to help them assimilate better in society. Let's talk about the second type of special caseload, supervising mentally ill offenders. Well, let me just talk a little bit about what your book doesn't talk a whole lot about this issue. It's the concept of deinstitutionalization. And right now, our prisons and jails are probably the largest mental health provider in our society. And that's not what prisons and jails were intended to be. What happened was, back in the 60s, with the advent of psychotropic medication, mental health providers found that people with mental health issues could function great in society as long as they took their medication. So what happened was, they got all these people suffering from mental health issues on medication. They released them from the mental hospital because they didn't have need to be there, you know. So if they didn't have the patients and they couldn't fill the beds, they started closing down these mental hospitals. So by the mid-70s, most of these mental hospitals were shut down. Well, here's what happened. Sometimes people with mental illness start feeling better and they stop taking their medication. What happens if they stop taking their medication? Well, their old behaviors come back. And so then what happens? Well, you know, a lot of times law enforcement comes and they pick these people up. Well, where law enforcement is supposed to take them? Well, all the mental health facilities are now shut down. So where do they go? Jails and prisons. Well, we're not equipped in community corrections, most of us. We don't have specialized educations in how to deal with mentally ill. Although some of us might, we have some background in it, and that's possible. The problem is that we got to get these people out of these jails and prisons. Why are we punishing mentally ill people for being mentally ill? Same thing with these substance abuse addicted people. Why are we punishing people for being an addict? Do we punish people for having diabetes? Do we punish people for having cancer? No, we don't. Those are illnesses. Now, you know, you might have your own philosophy and you might think, oh, addiction and alcoholism is not a disease. Well, that's your perspective, but I can assure you that there's a substantial amount of research out there that indicates that it is. So even if you disagree with it, the current modality in community corrections for us dealing with this type of offender is to deal with it as a disease. Okay, that being said, back to the mentally ill offender. They actually have been diagnosed with a disease by the psychiatric community. So how do we deal with them? Well, first of all, we want to be aware of services in our area. And I know I harp about that a lot, but you've got to know your area and you got to know what resources you have available. You know, where can they get treatment? Where can they get free medication? Are there any mental health courts in your area? And a lot of bigger cities are using mental health courts, which are very similar to drug courts. The next group of specialized offenders that I'll talk about are the sex offenders. It's the worst group I like to talk about. I hate talking about them because they're just such a difficult group to deal with. And if I weren't on camera, I would tell you how I really feel about sex offenders. But one thing you should never do is document things on camera, in writing, or in any way, shape, or form that can come back on you. So I'm going to keep my personal opinion about sex offenders to myself. And that being said, 60% of all convicted sex offenders are under community supervision. For some unknown reason to me, our court system punishes drug dealers more harsh than they do sex offenders. What are we going to do about that? Well, we can't do anything until laws are changed. So in community corrections, we have to supervise them. And you have to be careful because they're very slick and they lie a lot. So a controversial way that we're supervising them is by using lie detectors. Now, we know that lie detectors are only, effective or correct 75% of the time. And, you know, you'll see different statistics on that. Some say 85% or whatever. The bottom line, though, is that you can't use the results of that in court because the courts don't accept the results of lie detection tests. But it's a great supervision tool. It's a great treatment tool because what it does is you have the offender come in, do the lie detection test, get a baseline. You know, how many victims have you had? And if they say 5, that's great. That's your baseline. If they come back in 3 months, you do another one. how many victims have you had? If they say 5 and you get a hit on that they're lying, then you have an intervention, if you will, area that you as the community corrections officer can address. So when dealing with sex offenders, the key thing you need to worry about is sex offender registration laws. So Megan's Law, there's an Adam Walsh child protection law, but the thing I want to talk about and explain is registration law. So all sex offenders have to register, and different states have different time frames. But the thing is, as the officer, you need to make sure they're registered. And anybody, in case you're interested, on a sidebar note, every state police agency has a website that you can get on, and it's the Sex Offender Registry website. It's pretty easy to do, and you can see who's registered in your area and who, you might have a neighbor who's a registered sex offender. If you have kids, you might want to look into that, Anyway, so be aware of these sex offender registration laws. The final group of special offenders I want to talk about are gang members. Read your book on this and review that a lot, because I'm not going to get a whole lot into it, because we don't really have a whole lot of gangs around here, but you might in your area. So, you want to be aware of networking with your local law enforcement, because they have intelligence about gangs in your area. And you as the correctional or the community corrections officer, you're going to have a file. If you have an offender come in and sporting a new tattoo or something, that might be information that you can share with local law enforcement to work on the surveillance of drug or on gangs in your area. So I hope I've been helpful in some way, shape, or form. Thanks for listening. I'll see you again soon.